Welcome you all back to the last session of our conference. My name is Martin Summer, and I will chair this last session with the title, What Microprice Data Teach Us About the Inflation Process. And in this session, we will lead you into another, I think, very exciting modern corner of inflation research that has been spawned by technological developments, computing power, progress in data methodology, and also new data sources that could be accessed by these developments, allowing us to get a more, I would say, granular view of price changes, price dynamics. We can nowadays look at scanner data, we can look at huge sets of unstructured data, things we couldn't do before. And I'm very excited, therefore, that we could convince 4 outstanding experts on this topic, and I am looking very much forward to this session. And before we jump in, let me introduce our speakers. Only one of them is here with us, and the other 3 are online. And let me briefly introduce the speakers before we start with the first presentation. So our first presenter will be Oleksiy Kryvtsov, who is a senior research officer in the Economic and Financial Research Department at the Bank of Canada. And he is a specialist on this topic and very well known in the literature. We're very happy, Oleksiy, that you can join us today. We have also Chiara Osbat from the ECB. She's an advisor in the Directorate General Economics, and she is involved in all these projects, exciting projects that are going on there. Great to have you here, Chiara. And Fabio Rumler, my dear colleague from economics, is also a specialist in this field and has published extensively also on these topics. And he is, I discuss a lot with him. All I know, the few things I know about this exciting new field is basically from Fabio and a little bit from the literature. And finally, let me also welcome Raphael Schoenle, who is an associate professor of economics at the Department of Economics at Brandeis University and Brandeis International Business School. Raphael is also joining us online. He will, by the way, also be soon a speaker in our research seminar a few weeks down the road. Great to have you here, Raphael. Let me just remind you, speakers on the panel, about the rules I would like to, I would say, mildly enforce so that we can both listen to your presentation and at the same time have a little bit space for questions. So I would like to ask you to keep roughly within a minute of 10 minutes. I think that this would be optimal. And I also suggest that we have the presentations in the order as they are in the program. So let me therefore jump into the presentations and ask you, Oleksiy, first to give us your presentation. Please, Oleksiy.
I hope you can hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you very well, and the audience can hear you as well. Great.
Great. Well, thanks very much for a very kind introduction. I hope you can see my slides now.
We can see the slides, but there are some gray overlay boxes on it. Maybe you go on full screen mode, and then let's see what's happening. And if the boxes are still there, the colleagues might also load up the slides for you. But that looks very good now.
Okay, now that should be good. How's this?
There's still one gray box in the right upper corner, but just jump in. We will manage.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for a very kind introduction and for having us on the program. Very pleased to be here. Apologies for not being there in person. This is a paper with Alberto Cavallo, and very much in the spirit of this conference, we're very much excited, worried about the recent inflation experience. What can we learn from the microdata? Today, this paper is about using microdata on shortages or measures of shortages in retail markets, so at a very downstream level. We're going to show you 2 high-frequency measures of consumer shortages for 7 countries, including some European countries. And we're going to ask basically 3 questions. Can we associate these shortages with inflation? Secondly, can we learn something about the nature of these inflationary links? In particular, we're going to comparing more import-intensive sectors to less import-intensive sectors, supporting the narrative of supply chain disruptions may be playing a role. And finally, we're going to ask whether we can learn something more about the cost of replenishing inventories for such retailers. Quick summary about the data that we're working with. So this is the data that comes from scraping the websites of large multi-channel retailers. Most of them sell mainly offline. These are not online retailers. As I said, representing 7 countries, including France, Germany, and Spain from Europe. In summary, the data set has a lot of products, and it covers about 65% of the CPI consumption weight. And sectors that are present are food and beverages, furniture, household product, health, electronics, and personal care products. How do we construct these shortages measures? The data are scraped, right? So if you go on the website of a retailer, you can see banners with information about prices, or banners that saying, well, sorry, price information is not available. This product is not currently available. We're going to count this event as a temporary stock out. There's going to be a second measure when we're going to recognize that sometimes retailers will take out the banner from the website altogether, and we're going to count that event as a permanent stock out. And so we're going to sort of aggregate these measures into the temporary stock out rates and permanent stock out rates. So let me quickly show you how these 2 measures look in the data. Using for now the United States data, on the left-hand side, these are all stock out measures, so taken together, temporary and permanent. And you can see in 2009, there was a level about 10% rate. And when the pandemic started, it went up multiple times. And over the 2 years since the start of the pandemic, total stockouts have been elevated, in this case in the United States, and gradually coming down from the initial high peak. Looking at the composition of all stockouts into the temporary stockouts and permanent stockouts, which is basically a measure of net number of discontinued products. For the US, the picture is quite different. Temporary stockouts went up, that's the red line, and gradually normalized relatively quickly, whereas the permanent stockouts, after being up, they stayed elevated pretty much for all the time since then, even though they've been kind of going down. Just to show you, what happens across the 7 countries that are in our sample, the general tendencies are, as I already shown you, even though there's quite a bit of variation across these 7 countries. You can see on the left for temporary stockouts, China, for example, started earlier, but altogether the tendency has been down for stockouts. For permanent stockouts, you can see that for quite a few countries, notably US, permanent stockouts has been high, and that has to do for the US case with the fact that in the US there's many more varieties available for consumers than, say, in Europe. And finally, if we look at cross sectors, again using US example, there's a lot of differences in terms of shortages across different sectors. So sort of good sectors that normalize the health and personal care products, and sectors where shortages have been quite intense are electronics, household durables, and food and beverages. Okay, with this summary of how the data looks like, let me go to summarizing our main results. There's going to be 3 results that I wanted to advertise to you. First, we just going to do the brute force correlation of a shortage disturbance, so sort of unexpected rise in a measure of shortages. And again, we use 2 measures on the left and on the right, temporary, permanent. And we're going to ask if there was a spike in shortage, what do you see inflation at the 3-digit sector level, so at the relatively disaggregated sector level. And what you see is there's a very clean and economically significant effect on inflation at the sector level. So in particular, so the magnitude is such that if there was quite a large stockout shock, say going from 10% stockout rate to 20% stockout rate, a very large shock, that would lead at the sector level to inflation rising by 1.6% annualized rate, month-to-month inflation, within a month or so. There's a clear inflationary link there. We wanted to ask, can we say something about this inflationary link? Can we use some additional data to shed some light on where these come from? And here we did 2 exercises. where we separate goods or sectors by the exposure to imports. So here I'm showing you the breakdown on the previous picture, where we separate sectors in two groups. One is more import-intensive sectors, and the other one is less import-intensive sectors. Less import-intensive sectors tend to be those like unprocessed food, plants, printed materials, and those sectors that tend to come from countries that are larger, right? China, Japan, and USA. So what you can see is, in response to a temporary stock-out impulse, there is a larger and more persistent inflationary effect on those sectors that are more exposed to trade versus those that are less. The result is not so much clear for permanent stockouts, and that just tells us that in terms of shortages that have to do with retailers adjusting the number of varieties that they have available in the marketplace, the explanation for those decisions have less to do with exposure to trade, less to do with supply disruptions, much to a less extent than in response to temporary stockouts. In the second part in the related exercise, unlike the previous exercise that distinguished sectors by import intensity, we looked at the product level evidence for one large US retailer, which is in the top 10 by revenue in the US. And we asked, if we observe a stockout at the product level here, what do we see the tendency for prices of such products relative to all prices happening? And what you see here is that after a stockout, prices tend to go up shortly after, here within the two weeks or so. And most of this upward trend in prices after a stockout has to do with adjustments of prices for imported products versus prices for domestic product, which even though they go up shortly after a stockout, they tend to normalize on the second week after a stockout. So stockouts at the product level are associated with ensuing inflation, especially for products that are imported. In the final result that I'm going to explain to you, we note, here we juxtapose the total stockouts for the US, left and right in the blue line, with available indices for supply disruption pressure. So there's two indices. One on the left comes from the Pulse survey for small businesses in the US, where they asked about fraction of firms exposed to disruptions. On the right-hand side, it's an index of global supply chain pressures from colleagues at the New York Fed. On both graphs, you can see that early in the pandemic, the high supply disruptions were tracking closely with our measure of stockouts, okay, on both sides. Only in 2021, the two series diverged, they decoupled from each other. So supply disruption measures kept on rising, whereas stockout measures keep normalizing. So what's going on? The explanation is, in response to rising cost pressures, retailers can do two things. If they decide to keep their prices relatively stable, relatively low, they have to pass this elevated cost of delivering products to the marketplace into higher incidence of stockouts. That's what you see early on in the pandemic period. Later, the second decision that the firms can do in response to elevated costs is they can start rising their prices. If they rise their prices, they help curb the demand and they help keep the level of stockouts low. And we build a model that explains this dynamic, these different decisions about how retailers can pass through the elevated cost measures. And we can construct for each sector the estimated cost of replenishing stock. So you can see here examples of estimated cost. For electronics on the left-hand side, that cost was high, reflecting both high stockout rate, even though prices were relatively stable for electronics. In the example of food, say in the second half of the pandemic, in the later part, stockouts already normalized, but prices were going up. And so from the point of view of the model, it would say that the estimated cost of replenishing stock was rising, even though the shortages were already stabilized. And finally, this is my final result slide. We repeat the estimation of what happens after unexpected rise in the cost, and such shock in the cost through the lens of the model tells us that there's going to be a large response in this sector level inflation rate up to a 2% annualized rate within a month or so. And that increase will be twice as larger in sectors that are more exposed to trade. So the bottom line today for this paper is that we document this widespread increase in shortages in the retail market across a number of countries. there's a lot of differences across sectors, across countries in how these shortages play out. What we document is that these shortages lead to relatively fast inflationary response of sector prices, and that we can track these responses back to whether these sectors are more exposed to trade and possibly to supply chain disruptions. And overall, the conclusion from this work that we draw is that the joint dynamics of prices and stockouts can suggest that the higher cost of replenishing stocks has been an important driver of inflation during this period.
Thank you very much, Oleksiy, for this very interesting presentation and also for your great time discipline.
Thank you.
Our next speaker on the panel is Chiara. Chiara, can you hear us now?
I am on 2 devices, so if you can hear me, I can hear you.
Very good.
Is everything fine?
Because I got
good.
notice before that we had some connection problems that are now fortunately resolved. I'm very happy to welcome you, Chiara. Please start with your presentation. You have about 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me to this panel. And I'm going to talk about an overview of what microprice data can teach us about the inflation process, specifically looking at some web scrape prices that we collected within the Prisma Research Network. And it goes without saying that whatever I say today is my opinion and not that of the ECB or the Eurosystem. So first of all, also because also because the next 2 presenters will also be part of the Prisma network. Let me tell you a bit of what it is about. So it's a research network by the European System of Central Bank, devoted to understanding price-setting behavior, inflation dynamics, and gain new insight into the key element of monetary policy transmission, that is the price-setting mechanism. And we have collected and studied various kinds of microdata, official data underlying the HICP and the PPI indices, scanner data, and online prices. So let's look now specifically in terms of the online prices, what is good and what is bad about them. Well, the advantages are that they are high frequency, they're daily, and they can in principle also be scraped intradaily if you want to study dynamic pricing, which is a very active research field right now. They're timely because yesterday's data are available today. They're precise because the price of a given product is the price of a barcode and not a unit value or the price of a generic product category. And then you have metadata like, was it on discount? You don't have to rely on special sales filters, for example. And they are a very large volume, so you have a lot of data. Now, on the bad side, they're not always representative because they can refer sometimes, depending on the kind of shop, to a specific zip code or even to a specific customer. They're non-homogeneous because, of course, every website has completely different way of organizing the information. They are bulk, which refers to the volume, and bulk means that you're not going and handpicking the prices you want. You have to collect them and then classify and map them to statistical categories, and that's why the large volume makes you smile, but also give you a headache. Now, let me go a little bit more into this headache. So online prices are not just a few clicks away, right? There are big challenges in building web scraping data pipelines. And I think if you were to ask me what is the biggest thing I learned or the biggest thing that surprised me in the past years when working on this is the scraping is actually the easy part. It looks complicated, but that's really the easy part. It's by now a commodity. What has been and is very hard is having conceptual definition. So you have to create a harmonized data model, develop meaningful aggregation rules, collect, validate, store data and metadata, monitor the data flow every single day, and classifying the data to a common classification system, which in the EU is the ECOICOP. And this has 2 separate aspects. One is analytical. It's also a very active research agenda there, which is to develop artificial intelligence classifiers. And specifically, we have a multilingual problem. And it's very expensive to train these classifiers because they are supervise machine learning kind of problem. So you need to have a training set, and you need to build by hand training sets in every single language. So there are also algorithms that allow to do transfer learning and kind of carry what you learned about classifying, say, German products into French, into Spanish, into Italian. And there are colleagues working who have worked and continue to work on that. And then there's another aspect, which is the MLOps, the machine learning operation aspect, that we have to continuously develop, monitor, maintain, deploy these classifiers. Now, what is hard about it is that this must be automated. It is not sustainable to do it by hand. It's absolutely not scalable, but you want to scale, so you have to automate. Now, the good news on that is that this is also becoming kind of a commodity offered by the various cloud service providers. So this is on how we get them, or how to get these web scrape data. Now, the next is how can one use them? So I'm going to start with the overview of a paper, a study by colleagues in the Prisma Network, who, however, in the National Bank of Poland, started this enterprise of collecting prices first manually and then more and more automatedly more than 10 years ago. So having started 10 years ago, they have time series, they can do everything they want, and they recently published International Journal of Forecasting paper, now casting food inflation with a massive amount of online prices. You see how they match in yellow the official month-on-month index of food and non-alcoholic beverages inflation. That's quite striking. And what they learned in this process is that you can substantially reduce the nowcasting errors with respect to pretty much any popular benchmark. They found that volume helps, but you cannot use volume in bulk, right? You have to do a lot of work to do the COICOP classification. You have to choose the products that you're going to put into the index, and you have to be very knowledgeable and very precise about the official CPI methodology and apply it to construct the indices in order to be to do this good at nowcasting. They also find that during 2020, when we all had a lot of trouble, in getting inflation right, the accuracy of the baseline model actually increased with respect to the benchmark. Now, if you do not have 10 years of online data, so you have to wait it out. They grow very fast, but they grow very much in volume, but they grow day by day. No, we have to wait years to have years of this data. And that doesn't mean we have to wait. We can do many other things. So one thing we did was related to inflation measurement, and we used proof of concept data, so some kind of manually scraped data that we had to experiment with methodology. And this is work by my colleagues Bernard Goldhammer, Lukas Henkel, and Goshka Ozhevich in 2021, which is a paper entitled Representation, Bias Related to the Breached Overlap and Linked to Show No Price Change Method. Now, for those of you who don't read about the methodology of HSEP on the beach, maybe drinking a Grüne there are three implicit methods to account for quality changes that are used in the manual of HSEP. One is direct price comparison, which means there's no quality difference, it's all price. There's linked to show no price change, which is the other side of it. So the price difference is equal to the quality difference. And then there's an in-between, which is called bridge overlap. I spare you the details, but basically what they did is using both a Dutot and Jevons aggregator for the elementary price indices, they simulated how the index would look by using each of these quality adjustment methods. And what they found is that disregarding the price changes at replacement can lead to a very substantial downward drift in a price index. So they issue a warning for methodologies that once you apply these, in order to apply these implicit price adjustment methods, you have to really carefully check the underlying assumptions, or you can get all kinds of trends. And then for the euro area in particular and the EU, where each NSI can use different methods, then there's an extra problematic of having kind of spurious price trend differentials in some sub-indices just by one choice on another being practiced in different countries. And Fabio also worked a lot on this, by the way. Then coming closer to the data that we are now collecting, you can also use this data for inflation monitoring. We had between 2020 and 2021 in Germany, first a rebate on the VAT in July 2020. And then that was already announced when it was applied that it would be reversed in January 2021. And on the left, you see day by day the month-on-month price change in supermarkets, specifically supermarket data prices. And you see very clearly the drop in July 2020 and then the reversal in 2021. Now, this is not just monitoring. We used it, of course, to monitor day by day if we could make a good judgment of how fast the pass-through of the VAT or a complete as well would be into these particular categories that were exposed to it. But you can also then speak back to the theory because we found in the research network, but this is already a result in the literature and other data and other studies, that inflation is very much driven by the relative frequency of price increases to price decreases. So more by the frequency of price change than by the size of these price changes. And here on the right, you see the corresponding frequencies of price decreases in blue and price increases in red. And you see these huge spikes and this basically dominance of price decreases and price increases in the two occasions. Now, this was 2020, 2021, and indeed these were legacy data. More recently, we can use these kind of more bulk data that we start to have. Unfortunately, only more recently, our pipeline started to really produce a lot of data on what is happening with the return of inflation. So in Germany, on the left here, you see, again, in red, frequency of price increases and frequency of price decreases in blue. The increase in January and, to a lesser extent, in February 2021 in the frequency of price increases. It went back pretty much after 2 months. And then the little data we had also in the middle of the year tell us that there was a relatively low frequency of price increases and decreases in supermarkets. Now, once you come to March, April, and May 2022, you see a definite increase of these frequencies, although we're far from what we had with the VAT. Now, how do we interpret this? That all of us are asking ourselves, are we now in a moment in which non-linearly we have to expect a much faster, much bigger pass-through of shocks than usual because what were relatively sticky prices have become all flexible? Well, this tells us that we are still in between. We're not at this full flexibility that we observed at the beginning of 2021 when the shock VAT was very well known, exactly common to all shops across many, many goods. So if you think of price flexibility in terms of an information processing setup, then you would say that the signal that, at least in food prices and groceries, operators are having is not as clear as the one they had with VAT. Now, parallel to the increase in the frequency of price changes, of course, you tend to see a decrease in the sizes of these price changes, which is exactly what we saw in 2021, when very high frequency, but the size of the price increases was concentrated around this about 3 percentage points. That was the change in the VAT. And now we are back at more or less the same level that we had in the similar months of last year.
Chiara,
now,
I'm afraid you have
to
conclude because we are running out of time.
I'm indeed concluding, and I'm already eating a little bit in Fabio's presentation in a while, because one other thing we learned is that there is a lot of heterogeneity between the various retailers. And this brings me to say that these online data are especially good when you complement them with scanner data, because these very fresh data, they only have prices. So they can signal some fresh facts and point us to what should be analyzed, but then you really need the scanner data that have similar objects, the price of similar objects, but they also have the quantities. You can estimate price elasticities, you can consider impact of market shares, see the impact of market power. And when you also had household panels, you can even understand the heterogeneity of experience inflation across different demographics. So I turned happily to Fabio, who can tell us a lot about this.
Thank you very much, Chiara, for opening us these exciting perspectives onto the workbenches of the Prisma project. It was really very impressive. Fabio, you are next.
Yeah, so while the slides are going to be uploaded, let me thank the organizer for putting me on this panel and you, Martin, for the kind introduction. So yeah, I'm continuing where Chiara stopped. And my talk is about scanner data, analyzing scanner data in Prisma. So Prisma, you know, this big research network of the ESCB. We have 3 micro data sources that we're basically analyzing, which is prices from the CPI statistic of every country, the online prices that Chiara talked about, and scanner data. And when we talk about scanner data, we have to again differentiate between household scanner data supplied by GfK and Kantar, 2 market research companies, and supermarket scanner data supplied by IRI. These data have the unique advantage that they offer information on first the precise good identified by the barcode that's on each package of the good on the back side. So you can really identify a very narrowly defined good. And you have also information, and that's the addition, on the quantity sold. So the questions that you can answer with this data is manifold. For instance, you can go into inflation heterogeneity across households, but also across countries, since the data is regional. We know where the households live, we know where the supermarkets are, so we know where the prices are set. Questions about consumption behavior, substitutions, consumer substitute when prices are going up. Also, since the data include information on whether they are online or offline prices, differences between online and offline prices, questions about price setting in general, for instance, pass-through of shocks to consumer prices, all these kinds of data under the microscope. And these projects that are listed here are just the projects that use scanner data in one way or the other, household or supermarket scanner data that came out of the Prisma, and these are the projects that are available, or the papers that are available as drafts, but there might be still more in the pipeline. And what I'm going to give you in this talk is a few teasers about some of these projects in order to make you maybe some appetite to look into those papers and find out what they contain. So as I said, two sorts of scanner data, supermarket and household scanner data. So the unique advantage of household scanner data that we have real transaction data. So we see when the household buys or purchases a good, it's scanned and it's transmitted to the household panel holder, which is GfK. So we have actual transaction data, which is not the case for the supermarket scanner data, because here we have unit values, which is sales accumulated over a week divided by quantities sold, and that's why we have only weekly averages. In that sense, no true micro prices. The time periods are a little different, and the countries covered as well. 16 countries for the household scanner data, only 4 countries for the supermarket scanner data. We know, as I said, where the household is located in the one case, or where the shop is located in the other case. And the big disadvantage, the data cover only so-called fast-moving consumer goods, which is basically everything you can buy in a supermarket, which is mostly food, but also personal care items, pet food, cleaning products, stuff like that. That's basically covered. That's about 15 to 20% of the whole basket. And every statement I'm going to make is about this chunk of the basket, and it should not be generalized to the whole basket. So the first question that we ask is this data actually representative? By comparing the inflation rate that we get by calculating from these data with the spending shares of the households as weights and the prices that households pay. And that's the green line, you know, inflation from this universe of fast-moving consumer good, the green line, compared to, for instance, CPI inflation of food, which is the red line. And actually, you can see some correlation. Actually, correlation is 0.75, so pretty high. So we conclude the data is actually representative. Now, on the right panel that you see, this shows you or gives you the degree of heterogeneity that the data between household inflation rates that the data is able to deliver. So the blue line here is the distribution of household inflation rates in a specific quarter across all households surveyed in that quarter, and that varies from -5 to +10. So a huge distribution, and this is the distribution when you consider really the prices that the households bought, right? The conventional literature on this inflation heterogeneity that does not consider household scanner data and uses aggregate data from CPI statistic and prices from CPI statistic, assuming that all households nationally pay the same price, is the very narrow distribution that you see here, the green and the orange line. So the degree of heterogeneity, what you get with the household scanner data, is much, much bigger than you would get without using this data in the rest of the literature. So this is already one claim I want to make, is that heterogeneity is much bigger if you really consider the prices that households pay. So what is behind this heterogeneity? A natural candidate is income, right? And here we plot for Austria inflation rate of different income groups. And as you can see, doesn't look very different across income group. Maybe the only thing that's striking is when inflation is high, it's always the lowest income group that has the highest rate of inflation, which is actually the case, or should be the case right now. But overall, there is not a big difference. And again, I have to emphasize, this is confined to this fast-moving consumer goods. So we are not talking about energy, could be a different picture there. And the finding is not only an Austrian specific. If you look at the rest of Europe, so other countries, you would, if inflation is highest always for low income groups, you would always see the red dot on top, which is the case for some countries like Hungary, Netherlands, UK, Poland, but in other countries it's the other way around. So we don't see really a very systematic picture that inflation of those fast-moving consumer goods is highest for low-income groups. Another question that we're asking ourselves in a different project is a very Austrian question, by the way, are prices on the Austrian side of the Austrian-German, or let's say Austrian-Bavarian border, higher in Austria or in Germany, right? This is a legacy many Upper Austrians and Salzburg people go shopping, and on the other side, is this actually justified by price discrimination? So here we are comparing prices of exactly the same product across the borders in a 50-kilometer strip across the border. And we see on the top left panel that actually, the mode of this distribution, this gives you all those pairs of price differences across the border, and the mode of this distribution is actually near zero. So most prices are not very different, but there is a big distribution, and the mass of the distribution is in the positive side. This is Austrian prices minus German prices, so it already gives you an indication prices on average in Austria are higher than in Germany for those fast-moving consumer goods. And they are also more diverse across the border than if you look at the right panel and you include the within Austria and within Germany price differences, then they are much more aligned to the zero line. The good news is then, given or notwithstanding these price differences in inflation rates of the very same goods are not that diverse, and the median is near zero. So we have price differences, but not inflation differences, which is a good news. This is comparing online and offline prices, and basically also from this data set for France and UK, where you have information about online and offline purchases. We don't have it for Austria. And basically what this picture tells you is that there is no real difference. I mean, in France, from the period that really the online share is significant in the sample. Before 2013, it was a very low online share, but after that, subtracting, online minus offline prices, it's always near the zero line, meaning, okay, there is not much difference for France and the UK as well. So this is, by the way, in contrast to some of the literature out there that says that online prices are actually lower than offline prices. In this data, we don't find that. And last slide, and this is actually just giving a teaser about two projects. Names are written here, so it's not all my work, of course, that work with scanner data from supermarkets. And the left panel tells you that there is evidence of state dependence in price setting. What do I mean by that? What you see is the probability of a price adjustment as a function of the price misalignment. So price misalignment is measured as the deviation of the price from the average price of that particular good in that country at that particular time. And the further away it is, the more likely it is that the prices are changed, which is a clear sign of state dependence. And also interesting to see here, it's asymmetric. Prices that are too low have a much higher probability of being changed than prices that are too high. And on the right-hand side, finally, three authors, Chiara is one of them, she might answer questions if there are some on these graphs. What is the pass-through of producer corporate taxes across different regions and different store types? So in Germany, actually, you have very regional corporate tax rates, because they depend also, part of them depends on the municipality, so they can set the corporate taxes. And there's often a change in that. So, and it's a very nice natural experiment to study whether the change in this regional corporate tax is passed on to consumer prices. And this is basically what this paper is doing. And what you can see here from the top graph is that the pass-through is stronger the higher the income in the sales region is, right? In the region that where the outlet is located. So obviously, richer regions, apart from the very top panel, the very top quintile, but the richer the region, the more prices, the more corporate tax changes are passed on to prices. And in the bottom, even more interesting, across store types, changes in corporate taxes of producers are much more passed on in hypermarkets and supermarkets than they are in drugstores and discounters, which in a way confirms the notion that discounters try to keep the prices as low as possible for as long as possible in order to shield their customers from price increases. Yeah, I hope that with these teasers actually about this huge body of work that is doing, I generated some appetite to look into those papers and really, and I think it's really worth, because there's a lot of results that I could not convey here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fabio, for a very interesting presentation. You convinced at least me that I should read even more of your papers now. Thank you. And with this, let me come to the last speaker, Raphael Schoenle. Raphael, please start your presentation now.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes, yeah, we can hear you. We see the slides. You are set. Perfect.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here virtually, and I am going to talk about what can we learn from 60 years of PCE inflation data, which is joint work with Dominic Smith at the BLS. Let's see. So what motivates us here are long-term changes in inflation, which I'm showing you here in this figure, as the inflation series based on the PCE inflation. And you see there have been dramatic changes over time. We all know them very well. But there's a lot hidden behind aggregate measures of inflation. In particular, we are showing in this ongoing work that the cross-sectional distribution of the underlying disaggregated inflation rates has systematically changed in the last 60 years. In particular, extreme increases in inflation have become more rare, while extreme decreases have started to appear. Inflation itself is quite granular, and in fact the importance of granularity has increased over time. We also find that the ranking of mean versus robust measures of inflation has been inverting, and decreases in the variance and the covariance of individual series have occurred. And this sort of suggests that after 1990, the inflationary process has been more and more driven by idiosyncratic shocks. In the modeling side, we find that we need to work with a heterogeneous production model that features idiosyncratic shock in order to analyze appropriately the inflation stabilization properties of policy. And in particular, we focus here on the interaction of monetary policy regimes and measures of aggregate inflation through the distribution of inflation rates at a disaggregated level. So as an application, when we analyze the interaction of one regime, average inflation targeting, versus another, the conventional Taylor rule, with core inflation measures, given a shock to particularly idiosyncratic shock to the oil-producing sector, we find that targeting core rather than headline inflation achieves much of the inflation stabilization gains from average inflation targeting, but there are also additive stabilization gains. I'm not going to talk much about the literature here, except that our contribution lies mostly in considering a very long time span for analysis and the focus on mostly inflation through the lens of multi-sector models. The data that we base our analysis on is the PCE, the Personal Consumption Expenditure data from the BEA. This data has about 196 categories that we can add up to aggregate inflation and that we can define consistently. This is monthly data for about the last 60 years. So just to assure you, or to assure ourselves, we are able to reconstruct the aggregate PCE inflation rate that's published, and we match that quite well with our own data here. So this gives us confidence in the data. So these two lines that you could see here possibly are very close to each other. And our first fact that we sort of distill based on these data concerns the shift in the tails of the distribution that we observe over time. So this time series figure and the next show you different percentiles of the underlying inflation rates. And in particular, you see that extreme increases, so particularly here in the 70s and 80s, given by yellow, in the 90th percentile have become more rare over time, while extreme decreases started to appear. And this picture is even more pronounced if you look at the higher percentiles, so the extreme right tails and extreme left tails given by the 99th and 1st percentiles. And our second fact concerns a feature of these data, which is the granularity of inflation rates. That is clearly related to these extreme distributions and the wide dispersion. So what I'm showing you here in this figure is a plot of the percentiles of the absolute inflation rates versus the theoretical percentiles that come from a normal distribution with the same mean and standard deviation. And you can see that these, the data align pretty well along a 45-degree line, meaning a log normal is a good fit, while the log normal has fat tails, which is one of the defining features of granularity. And you can incidentally also see that the top line, the red line, rather than the blue line with the round dots, has shifted up a little bit in the tail, so the extremes have even become more extreme here over time, and tails have become fatter. Not only is there granularity, but its importance has increased over time. We show this using an inflation decomposition following Foster et al., which decomposes aggregate inflation into an equal weighted component and a granular residual, which is usually large when series with a very large weight relative to the equal weighted share systematically differ from other series. So this table here summarizes the two components, contribution to the aggregate inflation rate, and you can see that as you move from the left to the right, the importance of the granular residual in the first row has increased from, I don't know, maybe a 20th to about 1/3 or 2/3 even in the recent period. starting to go out of the COVID period. And of course, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Here I'm showing you the two components plotted visually, and you can clearly see that while the equal weighted component dominated in the 70s and 80s, the granular component has increased quite a bit in relative importance, even going into 2020. Our third fact concerns the two different measures of aggregate inflation, mean versus robust inflation, where we find that the ranking has reversed over time, or has been reverting over time. Here you can see that in the early period, we use our full data span, we find that the median tends to be usually below the mean, and then only starting in the mid-80s has the mean often fallen for quite extended periods below the median. Our final fact concerns the variance-covariance matrix, where we find that the 5-year moving average of individual series variances and their pairwise covariances have fallen. You can see the average variance in green here, and measures of the covariance in blue and red, the bottom two lines, and you can see that while the average variance has fallen, the covariance has been falling by more in relative terms. So to account for these facts, we use a heterogeneous production Keynesian model with idiosyncratic shocks, and we follow some of my earlier work, which features heterogeneity in sector size and sectoral origins of shocks. For each sector, there's one. Where we also have intermediate input consumption and carbo pricing, and we sort of focus on the interaction between monetary policy and measures of aggregate inflation through the distribution of disaggregated inflation rates. And the two monetary policy regimes we consider here are Taylor rule, as well as average inflation targeting, interacting with a headline, or core inflation. So I have two exercises here, and I hope I'm on time. So in the first exercise, I just want to convince you, without going into detail, that we need idiosyncratic shocks in order to match our facts. So in this table, I show you, going across columns, various calibrations of the model. So the first one allows only for aggregate shocks. And the second one allows for idiosyncratic shocks to each sector. The third one allows for idiosyncratic shocks to one sector out of all 341. Going through 341 possible permutations of the economy, and then different other combinations of these first calibrations. And going across the rows, you see sort of summaries of the different facts we have, and you can clearly see that which we mark when we mark X having a success in matching a fact, that we need idiosyncratic shocks in some form or another in order to match our facts, in particular at the tails. So let me now consider a particular shock, one of the idiosyncratic shocks, but this is quite general. And here I'm considering a shock to the oil-producing sectors, which might be topical. And I'm showing you the distribution of the percentiles that we get from the impulse response functions when we shock these sectors, but no other sectors. And you can first see that on the left panel, average inflation targeting sort of has a pretty compressed distribution of these percentiles, while Taylor rule has a somewhat more dispersed one, at least on the upper side. And I can zoom in here on the center. You can sort of clearly see, if you look at the more inner part of these distributions, that on the left panel compared to the right panel, so average inflation targeting with the Taylor rule has a more compressed distribution in response to these shocks. Now, what gets us really excited, and sort of this is the main result of this analysis, is that there's a very pronounced interaction between monetary policy choices and measures of aggregate inflation. So let me tell you what I mean by this. So this table shows you the different measures of inflation we consider. So headline versus core inflation, and a Taylor rule versus an average inflation targeting regime. And you can see by comparing the second to the first row that there's the well-known result that average inflation targeting stabilizes inflation on impact, as well as over time captured by the variance in the last two columns of inflation, but possibly also the consumption. What's interesting is that if you consider stabilization of core, but not shifting to average inflation targeting, so comparing the third and the first row, that you gain much of the stabilization properties of average inflation targeting. You don't quite get there. And there's a little bit of a trade-off here with aggregate consumption. And the reason here, and I think that's quite interesting, is that focusing on the core has somewhat similar smoothing properties as if you have non-core shocks, as if you smooth everything using average inflation targeting. By nature, that these non-core shocks don't get sort of ignored, but only indirectly have an effect. And then finally, these two different policy choices and their interaction are additive. So if you compare the last line to no regime shift and no change, so the first line, then you sort of see that these benefits are somewhat additive here in terms of stabilizing inflation, mostly on impact, but also a little bit in the time series, and having beneficial properties for consumption volatility. And I can show this visually here. On the left side is the combination of average inflation targeting and focusing on core inflation, and on the right you have Taylor rule and core inflation. And you see, if you think back to the other picture I showed you earlier, that the distribution here is a lot more compressed for Taylor rule when you focus on core, and sort of somewhat more similar to the one on the left. So to conclude, we find that empirically the cross-sectional distribution of disaggregated inflation rates has systematically changed between 1960 and 2021. If we analyze the multi-sector heterogeneous production economy, which features idiosyncratic shocks, turns out that the monetary policy regime and measures of aggregate inflation interact through the distribution of inflation rates. In particular, we focus on core inflation. Targeting core turns out, rather than headline, to reduce inflation volatility, and there are additive inflation stabilization benefits under average inflation targeting and focusing on a core aggregate measure of inflation. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Raphael. Thank you very much for this presentation. We are now at the end of the panel, and there is now an opportunity for you to jump in and ask questions to the panelists. Are there any questions, comments in the audience? Or Ernest, somebody from the chat? While we are searching, let me perhaps start with a question which I would like to address to Fabio, but I could also address it to Chiara concerning the Prisma data. I mean, in this fascinating work, you showed us that you would see prices extremely granularly, but on a very tiny sliver of the index. So you said it covers 15%, 20%. And then eventually, of course, if we talk about inflation, we talk about changes in the index. And so what is your ideas in the future? How can you bridge this gap from this local view of the index to the index as a whole? Because eventually you need to make a connection there.
Yeah, I mean, there's various ways of extending the analysis. So first of all, there is one data source that we didn't talk about, which is the microdata from the CPI. And that covers the whole CPI, right? That covers services as well. And we have many interesting stylized facts. There's also a paper, Avan et al., published as ECB working paper forthcoming. So there will be all the details about this. And I mean, we had to exclude because some countries do not have energy products, but apart from that, it's really a broad coverage of the basket. This is one thing. Another thing is that we are, I think, in the process of extending the online data, the web scrape data, by more and more data that also reach into the sphere of services. For instance, in Austria, in the Austrian Central Bank, we are scraping also services from food deliveries. So think about Miam and other companies, and also from the tourism sector through Booking.com. So we are going into that direction in order to broaden the coverage. Of course, in some areas it's difficult, but yeah, we are doing our best to make the statements as representative as possible. But there are, of course, limitations to that. Maybe Chiara wants to add something to this.
Maybe the only thing I would add, and indeed also on ECB side, we're expanding as much as possible to services in particular and to other kinds of goods like furniture, to the extent that these things are on sale online, one can try to expand. But I think another way specifically for online data is as a lab to test general hypotheses. No, you have a theory that generates a testable hypothesis about behavior of individual prices that should apply, say that there's no reason that it would not apply to food or groceries or the kind of data we have. Then it's a lab for testing that has in principle external validity as well. That's another.
Mm-hmm. Thank you,
aspect.
Chiara and Fabio. So the answer is like expanding the technology to other online prices and eventually cover everything. Ernest, if I saw this correctly, I saw that Oleksiy had a direct question to Raphael, which I would like to allow now, except there is a question in the audience right now, if this is not the case. So please, Oleksiy, ask your question to Raphael, online to online.
Yeah, so my question is, Raphael, so the policy recommendation from your model is target the core, which is kind of in the old tradition, right? To kind of look through the volatile sector disturbances and respond to the core. But I think it's a little bit because of, in your model, when there's oil shock, the prices in other sectors in the core part of the economy respond right away. So it seems that they kind of tied together very, very tightly. So what if in your model it would take time for the oil shock to affect the rest, right? And this time lag, with this time lag, what would be the policy recommendation? Respond early on, sort of preemptively, recognizing that the oil shock will permeate to the rest of the economy with time, or wait and tighten later. And I think this is very topical, right? Today, many central banks have this question being asked, why haven't you tightened earlier?
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Yeah.
So, Raphael, what's your answer to this very topical question? Tighten now or later?
Oh, this is a very good question. So thank you, Oleksiy. It's a very big question. So I'm afraid I will not have a perfect answer here, right? So, in fact, we're just putting this together. We have not solved for optimal policy, so I cannot give you that. But I think you have a very good question, and I think I'll run this with Dominic through the computer later, and then maybe I can just fairly straightforward to change this. If I have to venture a guess, okay, I'm not giving a recommendation here. I think the mechanism is, or sort of the insight I gained here is that if you have these shocks, whether they're volatile or not, I haven't really said much about the process here. What sort of surprised me is that this focus is sort of a substitute for average inflation targeting, which has the smoothing property, right? If you have a long enough lag, it's smoothing it out, and it goes a little bit in the direction you're saying. If you ignore these non-core shocks, right, then sort of you're smoothing that out too. You're only allowing indirect effects through the network to affect other sectors, also like some general equilibrium effects. I don't think that would go away actually. So the main aspect of that would remain that you focus on this. In terms of the precise timing, I think the theory says this, and it's just coming into existence more or less. What I understand is that if you have idiosyncratic shocks, you can't really get the first best anyway, so it's very hard to say how you would move here if you had different timing or different policy choices, but we actually gain or not. So that's I think it's very hard to give actually an answer here with a model. But I think I really love your question, and I think it's actually in this calibrated world, it's easy to implement it and give you an answer. So I will get back to you.
Thank you, Raphael. Ernest, is there anything else from the cloud we should take into account here?
Well, I have one item here which might be of interest. It's a bit broader, but it's closely related to your kind of research. So Claudio Borio mentioned the relevance of large relative price movements also for aggregate inflation. Let me quote a piece of text from his recent research. The achievement of low and stable inflation on the back of credible monetary policy frameworks has coincided with a sharp and major drop in the co-movement of prices across finely disaggregated sectors of the economy. In other words, sector-specific price developments have become much more prominent in driving fluctuations in aggregate price indices. So he talks about low inflation environments. We are now actually in a very different environment where inflation has risen a lot. So it seems to me that your research, your analysis of microprice data, where you have very detailed information on sectoral price movements and even at a very high disaggregation level. So what would be your conclusion from this research by Claudio Borio, which I suppose you have read in the past?
Do you want to take
Yeah,
this?
I don't want to absorb all the questions.
Maybe you can start, Fabio, and then others.
Okay, I can.
Because
okay.
Ernest was focusing you so
Yeah,
much
yeah,
that I
he's-
thought he asked you directly this question.
Yeah, no, it's no
but
problem.
the others should not be excluded, of course. You start, Fabio.
Yeah. Okay. So in the micro CPI data, we have, of course, all the information about sectoral price changes and sectoral price rigidity, right? And that obviously makes a big difference. I mean, that's a well-established fact from the past already. Confirmed in the Prisma again that there is a huge degree of heterogeneity across sectors in the degree of price rigidity, and of course, I mean, the degree of price rigidity is an important parameter of models, but also I mean, feeding into the Phillips curve, and then also in the end into the reaction function of the central bank, with ultimately the notion that the central bank should react more to, you know, inflation developments of sticky price sectors. And there was the idea, or there is even a project in the Prisma that constructs, and then I'm gonna lead over to Chiara because she's working with it, that constructs a so-called sticky price indicator as, let's say, an alternative indicator for monetary policy to look at, because that's exactly the slice of the basket that's relevant, that creates the frictions and is relevant for the real effects of monetary policy. But Chiara, do you want to say something about this sticky price indicator?
No, maybe what I can add is that nowadays, so first of all, empirically, once you start to build these sticky price indicators, however you want to kind of implement the computation, you tend to end up in building a services prices with some exceptions. So we looked specifically, for example, at the methodology of Atlanta Fed, which takes these measures, these older measures of price rigidity by CPI sector, and then classifies the various categories into sticky or flexible in a dichotomic way, and then reaggregates. So we did the same. In the euro area, it's a little bit hard to do the same kind of separation, because you have many sticky prices, which are energy prices, and they're sticky because of the kind of contracts for electricity, for heating gas, and the like, no? But they're not sticky in the economic point of view, based on economic behavior of firms, which is the micro foundations of the models from which you get the result that you should optimally target sticky price inflation, no? So as empiricists, we have a little bit of a choice to make here. How do you implement such an index? But if you exclude energy on this, if in the euro area, on this ground, and also on the ground that the regulated prices, no? And there are also the sectors in which the idiosyncratic shock, the very large idiosyncratic shock appears, so you want to rather focus on the indirect and second round effects, then you end up in an index which is rather similar to HSEP excluding energy and food, which is the ECB's measure of core inflation, one of the measures of underlying inflation, but basically the measure we look at a lot. And also to a large extent very close to a measure of service price inflation. So in a way, you know, it's maybe there isn't. What I would say is that another aspect, and actually I would like to also regarding this ask Raphael a question, if I may, is how much of these cross-country relative price changes is due to the fact that when there is a common tradable component, those tend to move the same. And then you have the non-tradable prices. And within each country, the tradable and non-tradable inflation will be different. So how much of these tradables and non-tradables or services versus goods drives the Borio result? Now, related to this, at least tangentially, is the question I have for Raphael, which is you document a fall in the importance of the common component and the rise in the importance of granularity. Now, this is also at the same time that the common component became just lower. So do you think it was luck, like the idiosyncratic shocks were larger relative to the common aggregate shocks because the aggregate shocks were small? Do you think it was a change in the production structure? So when you have these multi-sector models, you have to look at the production structure. So has the production structure become such that it has absorbed common shocks, or do you think it was policy? I think it's asking too much of your model, of course, but have you thought about that? I think it cannot be the second because you also document a decrease in the correlation of the granularity, if I'm not wrong.
So I would suggest that, Raphael, you give a brief answer and then you both continue this technical discussion bilaterally afterwards. So what's your short answer, Raphael?
Short answer is, these models are complicated, and I really, the scientific answer is we are learning a lot more how these things interact. Actually, it's great that you guys are collecting data. I actually want to give a big applause to Prisma here. It's going to be a goldmine for research for years to come. And in some aspects, what I found an obstacle is that there's very little data on the interconnectedness of producers. So it's somewhat difficult to attribute things to changes in the variance-covariance structure by itself. It can just be the nature of shocks have changed for some reason, or it's really that people through globalization or other deglobalization, the interconnection and the marginal cost has been more integrated or less integrated. So I think there's actually some maybe down the road stage for another network or something like that, where we need to learn more in order to put concrete numbers onto that. I believe some of that is due to the change in the network structure, and I think there has been some work on this. And I think the number that pops up in my head is about a third or so, but don't quote me on that. And the short answer is really it's complicated. There are many factors in here, and we need better data to really pin down this one isomorphism or not that I pointed out.
This is an excellent closing message. It's complicated. We take the message. Thank you very much, Raphael. I would like also to thank you, panelists, Oleksiy, Chiara, Fabio, and you, Raphael, very, very much for sharing your research and insight with us. It was very interesting. I thank the audience in the room for their patience, for bearing with us so long for a two-day conference. I thank very much the audience at home, but we are not yet finished. I have now the honor to ask our Vice President, Mrs. Barbara Kolm, who gave us the honor to give closing remarks. Please take the floor.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction, and thank you for joining us here at our premises at the Central Bank. I've been asked, as you were told, ladies and gentlemen, to provide you with some closing remarks to this 49th OeNB Economics Conference and the 35th SUERF Colloquium on the return of inflation. And yes, it has returned. And as the governor already said, no question mark, but rather a full stop and what will happen in the future. So let me start by thanking the wonderful speakers and the panelists. Thank you all for your insightful presentations, the stimulating discussions, and the great contributions which gave us a lot of food for thought in the past days. And of course, you know, looking ahead in time, I mean, we had over 30 papers. Many of them were very technical, but others were, you know, very comprehensive, touching all parts of our questions that we need to face when discussing inflation. But a big thank you also goes to you, ladies and gentlemen, who are the participants of this conference, those who came to Vienna and joined us here at the Österreichische Nationalbank, and those who participated online and from more than 56, or actually from 56 countries. We had over 900 participants online and live here, and this only tells us that, you know, the topic was well chosen, and the lecture series is indeed very successful. So again, the topic is up to date and very, very relevant. And it's my pleasure to summarize some of those outcomes of the joint SURF and OeNB conference and remind you of some of the highlights and of this great journey that we have gone through the past 2 days and the intellectual debates and exchanges. And as you all know, that the OeNB is a pool of expertise, of experts, and it's so great to see them interact with the audience internationally and with other academics from other central banks, from other institutions, that we learn from each other and find solutions that will hopefully help us go back on track and meet the target that we as central bankers have, price stability. So we started the journey, as I mentioned yesterday, in yesterday's keynote session on inflation and expectations on and the policy panel, where the economists and monetary policy makers told us about their experiences and shared their views on the challenges they are currently facing on so many fronts. This monetary policy side was complemented by 2 academic sessions where distinguished scholars presented their current research, shedding light on the recent advances in forecasting and modeling inflation, on what microdata can tell us about inflation dynamics and the role and the importance of these inflation expectations. And I just remind you that it's the consumer and his expectations that also drives us. And we have learned that yesterday, and we had a focus on that and also on monetary education and actually what we need to do also as central bankers to go out and discuss that and get rid of this economic illiteracy that we see in many places. And I think this is also a big task, not only of us here at the OeNB, at the central bank, but in many other institutions that work on this field. So together we touched upon many important and interesting aspects of inflation, and I personally find it reassuring that inflation and price stability has not only been on the top of the agenda of us, the central bankers, but also of policymakers, and that also it has resurfaced to the topics in broad academia. And as I mentioned already before, it will definitely hit the schools, and it will hit the journalists, and they will have to deal with it. But they can only learn from you as experts. So please also translate the very complicated, the complicated outcomes of your papers, of your academic papers, into something that is understandable for the broader public and that helps them understand what situation our economy is in. So that tells me that we need to look at those issues from many different angles, as I just mentioned, and make informed decisions. Allow me also to highlight an example of our many highly specialized talking points, the research network Prisma, which presents itself as a blueprint for future cross-border multi-country collaboration within the ESCB. This network's final report will soon be published, and I highly recommend you have a close look at it. So now the theme of our conference, the return of inflation, certainly couldn't have been more on point. Let me recapitulate what we learned from history in the Magdalene lecture and how we analyzed and described our current situation in today's sessions. Starting in 2021, inflation rates began to soar all over the globe. In many countries, including Austria, inflation has risen to its highest level in 40 years. Latest projections, and here I have to say our team's projections were always up to date and spot on. Thank you to the team for that. Suggested that inflation is bound to remain high also in the months to come. In April 2022, World Economic Outlook, the IMF expects average annual inflation to come to 5.7% in 2022. In advanced economies, 2.5% in 2023, and to 8.7% in emerging and developing economies, and to 6.5% in 2023. For the euro area, the European Commission's spring forecast for 2022 predicts that inflation will reach 6.1% this year and 2.7% in 2023, which is more than twice as high as it was the previous year. When looking for the root causes of these developments, we found that energy has played a major role in starting the current surge in inflation rates. We have also seen that the underlying causes for the current increase in prices are complex and broad-based. There are indeed many factors that squeeze consumers' pockets. Pent-up demand amid supply bottlenecks is one such factor, as it translates into unusually high inflation rates for consumer durables like cars or furniture. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has caused major disruptions in the food industry and especially drove up already above average price rates for wheat. And last but not least, we are witnessing some of the fallouts from the COVID-19 pandemic. For example, in the service industry, restricted capacities, strict hygiene measures, and high input costs will continue to increase price pressures. So now, given these basic facts, what are the conundrums of our current situation? What are the major takeaways from our discussions? Food and energy prices, for example, tend to be highly volatile, even in absence of a global pandemic or war. So what are the prospects here, given that inflation of food and energy prices have risen to levels not seen in decades? Some of the price pressures are expected to lessen over the coming years as supply bottlenecks ease. Oil and gas price futures also hold promise for some relaxation on energy markets. However, there is no reason to believe that all of the current price pressures will disappear in the near future, unfortunately. We therefore must conclude that we have left the recent period of persistently low inflation rates, which posed major challenges for the euro area's monetary policy before the pandemic anyway. As the governor joked yesterday, many of us, or many of you here in the room, are way too young to remember what the 70s brought to your parents and to my generation. Back then we were used to higher inflation rates, but you, luckily, were born much later and have not experienced that. So we therefore must conclude that we have left the recent period, and we really need to look for new solutions. Instead, we have entered a new phase in which we are facing a new challenge. Most social, economic, and geopolitical trends suggest that inflation is here to stay, at least for the coming months. Hopefully only the coming months. Since we are in this new period of inflation, we have also tried to outline what other factors will determine our path forward. First of all, a swift transition toward greener energy away from fossil fuels will keep up the pressure on energy consumer prices for the years to come. Similarly, global warming with its adverse effect on agriculture production will cause food prices to remain highly volatile. Sadly, an end to the Ukraine war does not seem imminent, which, apart from the unimaginable suffering of human loss, further increases the threat to world food security and will keep the prices of certain food products high. Second, in response to disruptions of global value chains caused by the pandemic and due to the war in Ukraine, we see reorientation toward domestic or regional production, which has sparked a trend toward deglobalization. Just think about what is happening on the European Union level with the European Chips Act. On the other hand, on one hand, one should also foster resilience and secure production in times of crisis, but on the other hand, it hampers specialization and diminishes returns from trade, which again leads to higher production costs. As a result, some companies may have to put up with lower profit margins, whereas other firms will pass their higher production costs to the consumers. While climate change and deglobalization are key factors, they are not the only challenges that may threaten price stability. Even though labor markets have largely recovered from the pandemic and unemployment has returned to, or in some countries has even fallen below the pre-crisis level, some lines of business are beginning to see a shortage of skilled labor, with many firms being unable to fill the job openings. In the face of aging population and ongoing demographic challenges, skills mismatches in the labor market are also very likely to become more pressing over the next few years, strengthening the bargaining power of employees. We are therefore likely to see a push for higher wage increases. Just remember our opening lectures yesterday. What are our next steps going to look like? What is our best advice? Given the fact that policymakers and forecasters who saw what was coming and who correctly predicted the current inflation surge are very few indeed, many of us are asking, what can we do to be more prepared in the future? Definitely, many of the panels have given good answers, and I think it will be the art of our team to collect everything and to work using the outcomes of that and to create added value for everybody by making everything public available. Our models and analyses will need to be adjusted. In particular, we will need to include non-linearities and give more room to expert judgment, the latter being particularly hopeful in the face of large shocks. Generally, we should be more open-minded when detecting possible threats to the baseline scenarios. During times of high uncertainty, we will also need to pay close attention to tail risks. In view of multiple and intermediate factors such as the uncertainty of the duration of the Ukrainian war, second, potential new outbreaks of the pandemic causing persistent supply bottlenecks, just we'll see at China what is happening there, and the transition towards greener energies. Tail risks should be thoroughly analyzed and assessed. Because even though they seem highly unlikely to occur, the potential economic costs of mismanaging them would be huge. After all, we're just humble economists. We don't foresee the future. The lessons learned from the 1970s clearly tell us that we must not allow inflation expectations to become de-anchored. At the current juncture, with looming signs of economic slowdown in the wake of the ongoing war in Ukraine, this certainly poses a tremendous challenge for the monetary policymakers, and not just the monetary policymakers here and in Frankfurt, but also to fiscal policymakers in Brussels and elsewhere. So maybe we should always remind them that things should be kept apart and central banks should be kept independent and monetary policy should stand as what it is, monetary policy, and not mix things up. So we should therefore seek the counteract any risks of de-anchoring by clearly communicating and swiftly normalizing monetary policy and by taking appropriate measures to curb inflation thereafter. In order to achieve that, it is vital that central banks act independently, as already mentioned before, without pressures from the political sphere. So again, Frankfurt is Frankfurt, Brussels is Brussels. We always have to keep that in mind. Wage bargaining parties also bear a large responsibility when it comes to inflation expectations being at risk of becoming de-anchored, while in case of a supply shock, policymakers can do little to prevent a rise in inflation. Moderate wage settlements are a prerequisite for containing second-round effects and preventing the adverse effects of a price-wage spiral. We also learned from a presentation today that inflation does not impact everyone the same way. It is, in particular, vulnerable households that bear the burden of high inflation. While central bankers are closely analyzing the distributional effects of their actions, adequate fiscal and social policies will be required to compensate these households for their losses. In our current situation of unprecedented adverse supply and demand shocks, policymakers are especially called upon to ease some of the damaging consequences those shocks might otherwise have for those who are the most affected and who cannot help themselves. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me thank you first of all, with the organizers of the conference. First and foremost, I would like to thank all the session chairs, the presenters, and the panelists for their excellent and stimulating contributions. But I would especially extend my thanks to Mr. Ernest Gnan and his team from the Monetary Policy section here in our house. Thank you very much. A warm applause. To Martin Summer from our research section. To Dragana Popovic from SUERF. And also, as always, to our event management team here at the OeNB, led by Mrs. Susanne Drusani, but also including, and I asked them all to stand up then, Theresa Deubel, Nicole Fuhrmann, Katharina Eigenthaler, and Karina Roteneder. Thank you, ladies. And as always, since we rely on our technicians, my special thanks go to Thomas Geringer and who is our in-house technician, and to his colleagues who took excellent care of all the technical details. Thank you. And last but not least, to all of you who participated online or who attended a conference in person, who were here at our premises at the OeNB. Your interest in our debates and your wonderful contributions have made this conference a huge success. The biggest success, of course, would be if our conference served as yet another small contribution to and yet another stepping stone, our joint efforts to bring inflation back in line with central bankers' price stability target. So let's hope that our next conference that we host here and that we discuss, we will definitely look at inflation in retrospect. Well, I know this is a nice wish, but maybe we can do things together. I believe in the division of labor and what our experts can provide. So for all of those who came to Vienna, who flew in, who joined us here, have a safe trip back home or enjoy Vienna. And of those who stayed in Vienna, looking forward to having you back at our Österreichische Nationalbank. Thank you all for being with us.